Take a look at the structures of the brain that you're responsible for learning for your nervous system practical. We're looking at a view of the inferior portion of the brain. This would be the superior portion of the brain. The first structure to identify is a gyrus. So gyrus is singular, gyri, that would be plural. And then we're going to identify a sulcus or a sulci. So again, sulcus is singular, sulci is plural. To do this, I'm going to remove the model from the base, and we're just going to use kind of one half of the model to identify some of these structures. So when you take a look at the brain, the first thing you want to do is orient yourself. And this structure right here is always going to be a posterior structure. So we know this is the posterior portion of the brain, this is the anterior portion of the brain, which means that this portion here is going to be the lateral portion of the brain. The gyrus is, so when you look at the brain, you see all this kind of convoluted tissue. These pieces of convoluted tissue are known as a gyrus. More than one of them would be a gyri. A sulcus is going to be a shallow groove that separates a gyrus from another gyrus. So this here would be a sulcus. This would be a sulcus. This would be a sulcus. More than one of those would be a sulci. Cerebral hemisphere, right and left. So hemisphere means half circle. If I put the model back together, we can see that we're looking at a superior view of the brain here. These are two half circles. So this would be the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. Separating those two hemispheres is a very long, deep groove called the longitudinal fissure. We see the longitudinal fissure here. If we turn and we look at the brain laterally, we're going to see another fissure. It's going to separate important areas of the brain, and that is the transverse fissure. And to identify the transverse fissure, we see this very deep groove here, separating those cerebral hemispheres from these hemispheres, which are cerebellar hemispheres. So this is the transverse fissure. The central sulcus and the lateral sulcus, so again, I'm going to just use one hemisphere here. The central sulcus is going to be a groove, a sulcus that runs largely continuous from the longitudinal fissure, which is here. It's going to run fairly continuously all the way down to this sulcus here, which is the lateral sulcus. Okay, so again, central sulcus, lateral sulcus. The next structure to identify is the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe, the next structure to identify, or the next two structures, are the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. So the pre and the postcentral gyrus are going to be gyri, or gyruses, gyri, that lie in front of and behind the central sulcus. So on this model, if we're going to call this the central sulcus, then the postcentral gyrus would be here behind the central sulcus, and the precentral gyrus would be here in front of the central sulcus. How do we know that this is behind the central sulcus and this is in front of the central sulcus? because again we're going to use this as our posterior structure. So we've got central sulcus, a largely unbroken groove that runs all the way to this lateral sulcus. The gyrus in front is our precentral gyrus. The gyrus behind is our postcentral gyrus. Let's identify lobes now. So we're going to identify the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe. The frontal lobe is going to be the brain lobe that lies in front of the central sulcus. So if we're identifying this as our central sulcus, this would be the frontal lobe. This is the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe is the most posterior brain lobe back here. So this is our posterior lobe. And then our temporal lobe is going to be a lateral lobe that sits just inferior. This is our lateral sulcus. Just below the lateral sulcus, we have our temporal lobe. The corpus callosum, so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to use the other half of the brain model to identify these additional structures in your word list. We see the corpus callosum here. We see the thalamus, so this structure here is the thalamus. The hypothalamus is this structure here. Hypo meaning below, so if this is the thalamus, this would be the area below the thalamus, or the hypothalamus. The septum pellucidum is this structure here. The olfactory bulb, the olfactory lobe, to see that we're going to kind of flip this part of the brain model and look at it inferiorly. And if we put the other half together, we see these are olfactory lobes or olfactory bulbs. These have to do with the olfactory nerve, which is one of your cranial nerves. The optic chiasma. So to see the optic chiasma, we're going to need to kind of zoom in a little bit here. And these are our optic nerves, and as the optic nerves are transmitting signals from the back of the eye to the brain, there is a crossing of these nerves, and that's the optic chiasma. It's going to sit kind of behind this gland here, which is our pituitary gland. So pituitary gland, sitting right behind the pituitary gland, is this kind of X-shaped crossing of some of the fibers of the optic nerve, and that is our optic chiasma.